His human touch was his hallmark, and his sense of humor, accented by his famous one-liners, was legendary. He inspired his followers to rise above themselves for the greater cause, and that is leadership. To remind us of his style, I will quote from 3 of his speeches spanning a period of 20 years, back in the days when he wrote all his own speeches. These are his own words. The first is from a speech titled, "Encroaching Control, the Peril of Ever-Expanding Government," given right here in Phoenix, Arizona, to the Metropolitan Chamber of Commerce on March 30, 1961. Appealing not to the worst, but to the best in our natures, those of the liberal persuasion have used our sense of fair play, our willingness to compromise, and have perfected a technique of foot-in-the-door legislation. Get any part of a proposed program accepted, and then, with the principle of government participation in that field established, work for expansion, always aiming at the ultimate goal, a government that will someday be Big Brother to us all. He went on to say, "In this land occurred the only true revolution in man's history. All other revolutions simply exchanged one set of rulers for another. Here, for the first time, the Founding Fathers, that little band of men so advanced beyond their time that the world has never seen their like since, evolved a government based on the idea that you and I have the God-given right and ability within ourselves to determine our own destiny. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, handed on to them to do the same, or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States when men were free." The second quote is from Ronald Reagan's famous "A Time for Choosing" speech in 1964. For almost 2 centuries, we have proved man's capacity for self-government. But today we are told we must choose between a left and a right, or as others suggest, a third alternative, a kind of safe middle ground. I suggest to you there is no left or right, only an up or down, up to the maximum of individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. And regardless of their humanitarian purpose, those who would sacrifice freedom for security have, whether they know it or not, chosen this downward path. Plutarch warned, "The real destroyer of the liberties of the people is he who spreads among them bounties, donations, and benefits." The last quote is from President Reagan's first inaugural address, January 20, 1981. "In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. From time to time, we've been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule, that government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people. Well, if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else? All of us together, in and out of government, must bear the burden." President Reagan's words will ring true forever. He was unique in his ability to capture the spirit of our great nation. In just a moment, we will have a short video showing highlights of the lives of these 2 great leaders, President Ronald Reagan and Senator Barry Goldwater. But before that, I want to share a bit of personal nostalgia. While we were in Washington, my wife, Doris, sitting down here on my left, did volunteer work in the White House for the Republican ladies, one of her most fascinating assignments was working in Nancy Reagan's press office. I know that tonight brings back for her many pleasant memories of those exciting days. Now for our video, lights and camera, please.
The Goldwater Institute is happy to honor Ronald Reagan, an American president who won the support of an amazingly diverse political coalition.
My fellow Democrats, I voted for Ronald Reagan.
I'm delighted.
Well, maybe not that diverse. And we are pleased also to enjoy the company of First Lady Nancy Reagan.
It's just a hell of a good woman to have around.
Of course, for many of us, our earliest memories of Ronald Reagan were from the movies.
That floating crap game's still going on.
Which of the Reagan films did you particularly like?
Oh, I couldn't name them.
Why do you think he was so successful in the movies?
Because he took up conservatism in a rather healthy, full way.
And that helped his movie career?
Oh, hell yes. Got wonderful reviews on it.
Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, two Americans joined by a philosophical bond, best articulated by President Reagan in his now famous lecture on the subject of liberals in Congress.
It would be better to have none than to have some. But if there must be some, it is better to have few than to have many.
I learned more things just keeping my mouth shut.
Well, more seriously, our purpose is to honor Ronald Reagan, an American president whose conservative philosophy was certainly influenced by our own Barry Goldwater. Indeed, Reagan's first serious involvement in national politics was on behalf of Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign.
When I said, my God, this is a beautiful speech, but I can't give it. I mean, it doesn't sound like me. It's too well done. So we were sitting around the room and, well, what'll we do with it? I said, why don't you get Ronald Reagan to read it and see what he thinks about it? Well, Ronnie read it and he thought, oh, this is the greatest thing he'd ever read.
It became known as the speech, and it was delivered to numerous live audiences and on television.
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
If the speech was persuasive on Goldwater's behalf, it also served to bring national attention to the political potential of Ronald Reagan.
No government ever voluntarily reduces itself in size, so government's programs once launched never disappear. Actually, a government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth.
Indeed, it would not be too many years in the future that, urged by friends in California and conservatives throughout the nation, he undertook his successful race for governor of the Golden State.
California.
And 8 short years later, on January 20th, 1981, was inaugurated as the 40th President of the United States of America. During the Reagan presidency, the American people came to know and respect an approach which, if not new, was certainly unfamiliar. Make the nation strong, citizens self-reliant, government lean. Concepts which often brought conflict with the Congress.
I will not support a budget resolution that raises taxes while we're coming out of a recession. I will veto any tax bill that would do this, and I will veto spending bills that would rekindle the fires of inflation and high interest rates. The American people didn't send us to Washington to continue raising their taxes, spending more on wasteful programs, or weakening our defense. They sent us here to stop that.
If issues of personal liberty and economic freedom were constant themes, let us never forget that the belligerent actions of Soviet communism were a daily threat, typified by the 1983 downing of a Korean airliner.
It was an act of barbarism, born of a society which wantonly disregards individual rights and the value of human life and seeks constantly to expand and dominate other nations.
And let us also never forget that it was Ronald Reagan's Star Wars strategy, committing the use of America's economic potential, that served as the ultimate catalyst for the disintegration of the Soviet bloc. But don't take our word for it. Zbigniew Romazewski of Warsaw was a Soviet-trained physicist, later imprisoned as a leader of the Solidarity movement, later yet elected a national senator in Poland's New Democracy. Paraphrasing a 1992 interview, "I don't know if Star Wars could have been realized technically, but from the political point of view, it was the most ingenious idea that could be. For even if the Russians had decided to eat only one slice of bread a week, they would never have been able to afford to make such a thing. And at that moment, they realized their failure." Ronald Reagan, more than just another American president, but rather living proof that if you focus on doing the right thing, then seemingly impossible things can be made to happen.
I've never known him to be hard up for the right thing to do. He restored dignity where dignity had been lost. And he became a great representative of our country to other countries around the world.
I hope you enjoyed the video. It is a fitting way for me to introduce Arizona's most famous citizen, Barry M. Goldwater, born in Arizona on January 1st, 1909. To people everywhere, the name Goldwater is synonymous with Arizona. In fact, I would venture to say that this man alone put Arizona on the map. Barry Goldwater symbolizes our patriotism with his conviction, dedication, and faith in the American people. Senator Goldwater represents everything good about America. We are a nation founded on personal freedom and individual rights, and Barry has led the way for all of us. It is appropriate that the motto of the Goldwater Institute is limited government, economic freedom, and individual responsibility, the principles so eloquently articulated by Barry Goldwater. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my extreme pleasure to introduce a true legend in his time, the Honorable Barry M. Goldwater.
Siéntese. You know, this is a wonderful honor for me. I've known Ronald Reagan for many, many years. In fact, when I first knew him, he was rather a dedicated Democrat. But he saw the light. His new wife brought wisdom and light to him, and he's been on the right track ever since. But of course, Ronald can't be with us tonight. He has some business in California that prevents him being here. But I tell you, I'd rather have what he sent over. I've known Nancy a long time. In fact, her father and mother used to live here before they passed away, and it was always a joy to visit with them. And I think that Ronald became a real conservative under their guidance. But that's not what I'm up here to do. I'm up here to introduce to you a young woman who has brought to our ex-president a joy and a wondering. It's a real honor for me, an honor that is very difficult for me to enunciate or to describe, to introduce this marvelous woman. She was one of the best first ladies Washington has ever had, and we hated to see her leave and go back to California. You know, if you had to go someplace, why don't you come here? So it's my honor and distinct pleasure to introduce this lady to you and to remind you that no man has ever gotten any place without a good woman. Nancy?
Talk to each other.
We have a beautiful award for President Ronald Reagan, and it's hooked up to a light here, so will you... There you go. There we go. Thank you. And on behalf of the Goldwater Institute, for President Ronald Reagan, and here to accept it, Nancy Reagan, we present this Goldwater Institute Goldwater Award for 1995.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, Barry, for all those kind words. I'm very pleased to be here tonight. I'm very pleased to accept this award on my husband's behalf, and I'm very pleased to be back in Arizona, a state that means a great deal to me personally. As Barry said, my parents used to live here, And starting when I was about 12, a few years ago, we would come here for my Easter vacations from school. And then when it came time for my family to retire, they retired here. They built a home here. And then later on, when Ronnie and I got married, guess where we spent our honeymoon? Right, Phoenix, with my parents. Now, I'm sure that a lot of young people couldn't understand that, but to us it was fine, just fine. In fact, it was through my parents that Ronnie first met Barry in the early 1960s. They talked politics and philosophies and about where they saw the country heading, and I suppose it would be safe to say that the rest is history. I remember the 1964 speech, and I thought that all we were doing, Ronnie was doing, was giving a speech for Barry. Little did I dream where that speech was going to lead us. But it's important to note that back in the 1950s, it wasn't very fashionable to be conservative. And it took men like Barry Goldwater and my husband to lead us. They found they had a lot in common, and they made history by igniting the fire of the conservative movement. They believed that government should simply get out of the way. Ronnie and Barry fought for those principles which today have been overwhelmingly embraced. So they must have done something right. Just take a look at the extraordinary men and women who make up the 104th Congress, and of course its distinguished speaker, Newt Gingrich. The dramatic movement of 1995 is an outgrowth of a much earlier crusade that goes back half a century. Barry Goldwater handed the torch to Ronnie, and in turn, Ronnie turned that torch over to Newt and the Republican members of Congress to keep that dream alive. I know that Ronnie believes they'll succeed and that the American people support their efforts. So on behalf of my roommate, I'd like to express our deepest thanks for this special honor, and we're with you in spirit as you reinvigorate our nation. Thank you very much.
At this time, I have the pleasure of introducing a founding member of the Goldwater Institute's Board of Directors, a longtime member of the Institute's Executive Committee, and a man whose family has a long history with Senator Goldwater. None other than our first-term congressman from the 4th Congressional District, who will introduce his boss in the House of Representatives, the Honorable John Shadegg.
Thank you, John. Tonight truly is a unique event in American political history. As we honor President Ronald Reagan with the Barry Goldwater Award, the man who is our keynote speaker is the leader who is carrying on the tradition they began. As someone who was there when Barry Goldwater started his career and who has the distinct privilege of being a member of the 104th Congress, I am proud to be here tonight. The symmetry achieved by the presence of our guest speaker can't be lost upon anyone in this audience. Just as Ronald Reagan picked up the mantle and built upon the foundation established by Barry Goldwater, our keynote speaker tonight has picked up the mantle and is now building upon the work done and the successes achieved by the man we honor tonight, President Ronald Reagan. Like Senator Goldwater and President Reagan, our speaker tonight has changed America and changed it for the better. Like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, he is a strong and visionary leader. And like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan, he has proven that he has the courage to lead, the courage to stand alone, the courage to withstand the vicious attacks of the liberals in Congress, in the national media, and throughout our society. He is a man who's proven that politicians can keep their word even if they're members of the United States Congress. But beyond this courageous and visionary leader, there is another side of our guest, a side few Americans see, but a side that I have personally come to know. He is indeed, and not many people realize it, but it is true, a man who cares about people, a man who cares about the least in our society. He is an avid supporter of Habitat for Humanity. His own political campaign has purchased land and built and now completed a home for Habitat for Humanity, on which he personally spent 2 different Saturdays working on its construction. For his efforts for the March of Dimes in Georgia, he was named their Man of the Year. And in his personal support for public television in Georgia, he not only gave money of his own, but he raised 3 times as much money as had ever been raised for that cause in the past. Let me conclude with the words of Senator Goldwater, whom I asked about our guest speaker on Monday morning of this week. He began by whimsically noting that he had campaigned for him twice, and he had lost both times. He went on to say, and if you think about the source of this comment, you will appreciate its great import. If he keeps his mouth shut, he'll do all right. But he had some good things to say. He called him a brilliant student of history and said, and I quote, "I think he'll be a damn good speaker." Ladies and gentlemen, as a member of the freshman class of the 104th Congress, it is with tremendous pride and great admiration that I present to you the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, the Honorable Newt Gingrich.
Let me, if I might, just take one moment of, I guess, personal privilege. We had such a terrible tragedy this week in Oklahoma City. I wonder if we might just take one moment to remember in silent prayer all of those families and all the people who've suffered so much and who, as fellow Americans, our hearts have to go out to. So if you would just join me for one moment. Amen. Let me say that it is for me an extraordinary moment when John Shadegg came to me, and it's a sign of my age that the first 2 times I came and tried to campaign for him, I kept talking about Steve, because the first Shadegg I got to know was your speechwriter, campaign manager, and author of a book. So I was thrilled to have the tradition coming on. But John has convinced me since then that he is going to be a star in his own right. But he came and he said, "The Goldwater Institute would like to honor President Reagan and would like you to speak there." Now, just the symmetry, as somebody said a while ago, of being allowed to be up here with Nancy Reagan and Barry Goldwater was such a great honor that I was thrilled at the prospect. And frankly, having had a chance earlier this evening to chat with both of them, I feel even more strongly. You know, Nancy made the point about what it meant when they first came to Arizona and first getting to meet Barry Goldwater up close and listening to his unvarnished and rather direct language. And I'm a student of Barry's. And I think that, I wish I'd thought of this earlier. I could tell Marianne, I'm just doing what Barry taught me. But I want to say it's fun particularly to be here now because 1 week ago, in Georgia, a tradition which you began in the 60s is continuing, in that Congressman Nathan Deal switched parties and asked to become a Republican. And that's part of that same process by which conservative after conservative comes to conclude that they just can't quite find any friends left in the Democratic Party. And then earlier today, I was at an event for Bob Stump, and a supervisor in northern Arizona also got up and said that he wanted to switch parties, and there's this continuing process going on all over the country, and I think that it's a wonderful thing that we are able to pull together so many different people from so many different backgrounds. And literally, as a history teacher, I believe it is literally true that the publication of the Conscience of a Conservative and the way in which that spread in the early 60s, and I first encountered it as a high school senior, and its clarity and its return to basic principles. And then starting in that October speech in 1964, when President Reagan first became a national political figure. He'd been an entertainment figure, he'd been making speeches, but I think from that October night onward, a man who would help define America had been, I think, brought to the attention of the conservative movement. And literally, I think you can see each of us, in a sense, standing on each other's shoulders. And President Reagan literally stood on Senator Goldwater's shoulders. I find myself, I just spent some time writing a book which will come out this summer called To Renew America, and I found myself really going back to first principles. What did I learn in Conscience of a Conservative? What did I learn from all of President Reagan's major speeches? And in fact, as I was listening to part of the videotape, I began to worry that if enough people actually go back and read all those speeches, I'm not going to look very original at all by the time they... But it occurred to me that in a sense, the absence of originality is exactly right. That what Senator Goldwater and President Reagan stood for, and as a result of having the courage to stand, changed the future of the entire human race, not just the future of America. We tend to forget, in the late 50s, there was a sense that the Eastern establishment, which was real, was inevitable. And when Senator Goldwater first stood up in 58 and 59 and in 60 and began making his speeches, excuse me, there was a sense that this was inconceivable. I mean, how could a handful of people, Bill Buckley with a tiny magazine, some senator from Arizona, and back then, again, I don't want in any way to be offensive to the many fine people of Arizona or the wonderful city of Phoenix, but I remember as a child, an Army brat growing up in Georgia, that a senator from Arizona didn't quite sound the same as, say, a governor of New York. Just to pick an analogy. And yet all across America, there were lots of people starting to say, hey, he's got something. I wrote down a while ago, it struck me that there were, and this is partly just because the language works, but if you think about first principles, 3 words that begin with C: creator, Constitution, and courage. The notion that unlike any other society in history, we believe that power comes from our Creator to the individual, and then we loan power to government. But power in America does not come from government. Never comes from government in America. That's a European idea. In America, each of us has power, and then we decide to loan some back. And here was this guy from Arizona going around saying, the government's taken more of our power than we need to give it. Let's get some back. And in a very real sense, Fife Symington and Mike Leavitt and the entire effort to create the 10th Amendment movement is exactly descended from Barry Goldwater's early speeches on the question of where should the power be, and which gets me to the second word, which is the Constitution. Both Senator Goldwater and President Reagan had this quaint idea that we had signed a legal document called the Constitution of the United States, and that we actually meant it, and that it would be useful to occasionally refer to it, and that it might suggest to us a number of guidelines. And this was a very radical thought in Washington in that period, because the Constitution was sort of something that was out there for the court to reinterpret as liberals thought useful, but it wasn't actually supposed to be read as though it were a document. Because if you read it as though it were a contract, it would bind you in ways that would be uncomfortable if your major goal in life was to take every penny from Arizona, sift it back through a bureaucracy, and send what was ever left back on the terms of the bureaucrats so the people of Arizona could live their lives more intelligently than they were capable of on their own behalf. And starting with Barry Goldwater's speeches, and then President Reagan's speeches, and then Senator Goldwater's book, and then the continuing evolution of the conservative movement all through the 60s and 70s, you began to see this notion that maybe we could begin a process of getting power out of Washington. Now, this is one of the core, and by the way, this is what the central fight's over about the child tax credit. What we've said in the House about a child tax credit is very simple. If you earn money and you have children, we think the best place for that money to be spent is by the parents directly on their children. Our liberal friends have a different model. Their model is if they take the money away from the parents, who after all probably don't really know their children very well and probably don't care about them very much, and they then hire a bureaucrat, say your brother-in-law. I mean, it is important to remember now when we talk about bureaucrats what we're talking about. This is the very same American who is inadequate to take care of their own family, if they are in a high-rise government office building and they're filling out papers, suddenly becomes dramatically more noble. Because we are all the same people. We don't have a special select group of aliens, despite the picture of me on the cover of that newspaper, which I think your husband also got at one point. We don't bring aliens in to become bureaucrats. They are the same people as the rest of us. But the theory among liberals is that that $500 taken from the family, given to Washington, to trickle back minus salary and office expenses, as defined by Washington, will be better for that child than allowing the $500 to stay in Tempe or Phoenix or Tucson or Flagstaff. This is a core argument, and this argument was originally stated for my generation by Senator Goldwater's first great book, and then was restated by President Reagan starting in 1976 in his speech in New Hampshire, where he said, what if we return to the states the tax money, the tax base, and then said to the states, if you want to do it, fine. But don't expect the federal government to do at a federal level things the states ought to be doing. And that speech in New Hampshire in 1976 is the direct grandparent, if you will, of what Fife-Symington's now trying to do with the 10th Amendment, which is to redefine what should be done by the states, what should be done by the local government, what ought to be done by the private citizen, whether it's in a nonprofit such as the Goldwater Institute or in a profit-making company. And then, having gotten as much as we can back home, what still has to stay in Washington? Now, the liberal model is the opposite. The liberal model is it important? Does it sound good? Can we do it in Washington? And then maybe some things are allowed to stay back home, but that's usually an oversight. I mean, there's always next year when we could pass a new bill to create a new bureau. If you think I exaggerate, get a list sometime of the current bureaucracies in Washington. And it's been 60 years of simply saying, tell me a problem, we'll create a bureaucracy. And what the Goldwater movement and then the Reagan movement represented, and now what the House Republicans are doing, and in all fairness, I think both John Kyle and John McCain will tell you, you're going to see the Senate spend all spring and summer passing exactly the same basic direction. I mean, you know, we are moving as a team in the same direction. The Senate has a harder set of rules. But the fact is, we always used to complain when we were on the House together that the person who was Speaker had enormous power and the people who were in the minority couldn't get much done, and that the Senate had a lot more opportunity for the minority. We've now discovered they both left the House to go to the Senate. We've now discovered we were all right, and except that now that we're the Speaker, we can get a lot done very fast. And it's the other team who sits around in the afternoon and goes, boy, this is really hard. You know. Now, but I think there was a third part of this, where both Barry Goldwater and President Reagan brought us back to the sense of being uniquely American, and that it is different. America is not just a pale version of being European. American's not just the Anglo way of perpetuating white supremacy over all the various people. America is, in fact, a unique definition of power in which God has given to each individual of all backgrounds the same opportunity, the same rights, the same legal status, and therefore anybody on the planet can become American. And that's why, while Arnold Schwarzenegger and Henry Kissinger sound sometimes a little unusual, they are both Americans. Because you can become an American in a way that you can't become German or become Japanese or become French. but it's a way of being. It's a civilization. And both Goldwater and Reagan taught us that it was a good thing to be American, that we are a great nation with a good people. And if we just let government get out of the way sometimes and let people have a chance to learn how to be better, we'd be astonished how much nicer and more caring we'd be to each other than if we're instructed by a bureaucracy how we have to function. Now, there's a third part to this. As they taught us about our Creator and about our Constitution and about our uniqueness, the third word that I suggested was courage. I can't quite imagine, and Marianne and I have been through a fair amount here, but I can't quite imagine what it must have been like in the late 50s to have been Barry Goldwater. I mean, I look back on what you did and the courage you had to just get up day after day and just keep telling the truth as you believed it. As you once put it, to go pooping around and show up in little towns talking to small groups and then suddenly have a nationwide movement that said, we want to draft you to run for president, and to take on the entire national system of power that had grown up since 1932 and all the things that that implied, to me is one of the great heroic events of our era, and stands precisely with people like Lech Walesa and Václav Havel and other people who believed desperately in freedom and who were prepared to stand and be judged by history because they knew they wouldn't necessarily be popular for saying it. In the same way, I think about the long period after 1974 when President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan left the governorship, first running against a sitting Republican president in a very unique and very difficult situation, then continuing the radio shows, continuing the speeches, running in 1980, going into town after town where reporter after reporter basically made fun of the welfare stories, made fun of the interviews, made fun of the speeches, and just cheerfully getting up day after day, going through the experience of Iowa, bouncing back in New Hampshire, winning the nomination, and then being faced with the presidential debates in the fall, knowing that you'd be up against an incumbent president who would cheerfully describe whatever his staff thought was necessary in order to win, and coming up with that perfectly Reagan-esque phrase that no other candidate, I think, since Franklin Roosevelt could have pulled off, of just saying, there you go again. And the whole country, I mean, to be able, with enormous pleasantness, to be able to, in effect, communicate that a sitting President of the United States might not have total factual accuracy. And to do it in such a pleasant way. And then I'll never forget, because I was in Griffin, Georgia, campaigning in 1984. The first debate had not gone as well as we'd hoped it would. But we also knew we were in pretty good shape because every pollster I talked to said, yes, the way 60% of American people are saying it is, our team didn't do as well as it should have the first round. We sure hope that we're going to do better on the second round, but nobody'd left the team. President Reagan got up and opened, and many of you will remember it because you watched it as vividly as I did, as he said, I know that a lot of people have raised questions about age, but I'm not going to allow my opponent's youth and immaturity to count against it. And Walter Mondale stood there laughing uproariously because there was nothing else you could do. And in 40 seconds, President Reagan had reminded all of us of the enormous power of humor in a free society to communicate things you can't communicate any other way. And I look back to all the things he stood for. You talk again about courage. How about an evil empire speech, which every liberal columnist jumped up and said promptly, how could you be so irresponsible? To describe a well-meaning totalitarian bureaucracy as though it were evil. To pick on a dictator who, after all, wants to be our friend as soon as he can devour us. To raise tensions with a country which is only invading Afghanistan and threatening the rest of the world. This is the kind of irresponsibility that the liberal press had worried about with Ronald Reagan. And then a decade later to have Gorbachev say, you know, it was actually quite helpful. Because once the President of the United States said we had no moral authority, we all said, well, we'd always thought that. And the younger generation of communists could all say, good, President Reagan agrees with us, we have no moral authority, why don't we change? And to then stand there and say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, and again, have exactly the same people who had managed to learn nothing in the entire intervening period. Once again, you can go back and check the facts. The columns were identical. I mean, they put the same word processor in and said, Reagan bad, communism reasonable, why don't you be more practical? How could the president go there and suggest the wall could come down? And I'll never forget, we were sitting in our little apartment in Washington watching the night the wall came down, and they were interviewing the president. And he said, well, I'd always thought there were Germans on both sides of the wall. And you talk about a Goldwaterism. There was that moment when you sort of thought, if he stops right here, it's all bad. Of course, by then he had successfully led the victory of the Cold War. But so the press was sort of beginning to treat him with more respect. But he said, and it was so obvious and so brilliant and the product of a lifetime of thought and care. Because he said, I'd always assumed that the morning the Soviets weren't willing to shoot them, the Germans would just pull the wall down. So I always knew it would come down sooner or later. And Sam Donaldson, for I think the only time I saw him in that entire period, was stunned. I mean, the wall was coming down. He was talking to President Reagan, who'd said it should come down. Reagan was making more sense than Donaldson could imagine in questioning. And it's literally the only time I think I ever saw Donaldson pander. And he just kind of went, well, gee, that really is right, and I sure am glad you were so correct, Mr. President. And I sort of thought, all it takes is defeating an entire empire to get a small amount of respect out of the press. Which leads me to believe that, frankly, the two most common characteristics these men share together is that they both had an instinct for appealing to basic Americans about the America they'd both grown up to love and the patriotism that they knew was in their heart and they assumed was in the heart of the average American without regard to what the press version was. And second, a calm, persistent willingness to tell the truth without regard to the elites and without regard to the Washington Press Corps. And here I will say unequivocally that while I don't do it as well, my quips aren't as good as Barry's and my eloquence isn't nearly as good as President Reagan's, but the willingness to believe in brute persistence is directly drawn from having grown up in their shadows. And I think I would assert, and I think the delegation, and I must say, by the way, that to be back here, when I arrived as a freshman, John Rhodes of Arizona was our leader. I served initially with John McCain, and I will never forget the support, the intensity, the commitment, the courage that John McCain just lives in his life every day, and that I saw on the House floor in several fights that were very tough, where he just automatically, instinctively stood side by side when there frankly weren't a whole lot of people showing up at a couple of those, but John was there. To have served with John Kyle, to be with Bob Stump today, who is a committee chairman now, thanks in part to the wonderful freshmen that you all sent us, Jim Colby, who has done, I think, a tremendous job, and if we can sort our way through the problems we're having with Mexico, it'll be in part because of Jim Colby's leadership and his understanding and knowledge of that country. To serve with John Shadegg, by the way, I do have to make one correction. I am not his boss. The genius of the American system is to be found, first of all, in the fact that John Shadegg, I think, has two bosses, his conscience and the people of Arizona. I may at best be his head coach, but that's a job he helps hire me for, so it's sort of a tentative relationship where I have to push him just enough to get rehired, but not so much he fires me in mid-season. To be with Matt Salmon, who's been so kind as to be with me twice today, and J.D. Hayworth, who's just a great freshman member. This is a very strong delegation, and fittingly comes from Barry Goldwater State. To work with Fife Symington, I think, is an important part of that. But the point I would drive at is that at every stage, my generation is working within the lessons of Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan. You can't understand, you can't begin. The contract with America is in fact built on a contract we had in 1980 in the Reagan campaign in October, which was the first time the federal Republicans had ever stood in the Capitol steps. And all we did was expand on it in 1994. But it came directly out of something that the Reagan campaign had done in 1980. We're going to go back, having met our goals in the House, we voted on 31 items in 93 days. As Dick Armey likes to say, even the 100 days, we're shrinking everything in the federal government. 100 days got to be 93. We got to vote on everything. We lost term limits, but we got 85% of the Republicans while losing 82% of the Democrats. We passed 30 out of 31 items and sent them to the Senate. In the case of unfunded mandates and the Shays Act to apply to the Congress, every law that applies to the rest of the country both went down to the President, and he signed both into law. He also signed, I believe, the Paperwork Reduction Act into law. We have begun the process of change. More is coming out of the Senate. But frankly, when we go back, the great challenge we'll face is the challenge of balancing the federal budget within 7 years. This is an enormous challenge. And I must say again on behalf of the Senate that I think Senator Domenici and the Budget Committee are going to start next week and will actually be ahead of the House by probably 2 weeks in beginning to move towards a balanced budget. And I think of this as being precisely in the tradition of the conservative movement that was created by Goldwater and Reagan. When you think about, you mentioned the Goldwater Institute's 3 core commitments: limited government, economic freedom, individual responsibility. I can't imagine things that would fit more perfectly into why we should balance the budget. Because I think the historic lesson's simple. We have a moral obligation to balance the budget, we have a personal obligation to balance the budget, and we have a national obligation. Let me explain all 3 very briefly. First of all, we have a moral obligation. Let me put it as directly as I can. This is our congressional voting card. This is the most expensive credit card on the planet. What we've done for the last 60 years, with increasing speed, is we've said to everybody who showed up, of course we can take care of you. What is it you want? And we've resembled 13-year-olds being given a credit card for the first time who don't realize that there is a bill that comes later. And so we've charged and charged and charged. In 1997, the interest on the federal debt will pass all of national security as a cost to the taxpayers. That is, in 1997, we will pay more taxes from you to the bondholders of U.S. Treasury notes than we will pay for the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, the intelligence community, and the Defense Department bureaucracy combined. Now, no society can continue doing this. And it is immoral. We had a great American tradition. We paid off the farm so that there was no mortgage, and we gave our children the farm. We've now replaced it with a tradition where we sell off the farm and we're leaving our children the mortgage. It is absolutely immoral. There's a second argument. It's personally not sustainable. Personally, I think at 3 generations. If you're a senior citizen, you need to know that the trustees of Medicare have said Medicare is going to go broke. It starts going broke in 1996 when we start to spend more than we're taking in, and it runs out of money in 2001 or 2002. Now, we've asked President Clinton to tell us how does he want to save it. We've asked AARP to work with us, because I think it's totally irresponsible to stand to one side and not be honest about the problem. The problem's not complicated. In the current federal government monopoly, Medicare goes up by 10.5% a year every year. You can't sustain that. No society on the planet's rich enough to sustain it. And furthermore, a lot of it is exactly the waste you would expect with any government monopoly. Former Senator Mac Mattingly called me the other day. It's a woman in Brunswick who's agreed to come and testify. She's on Medicare. She needed her stitches taken out, Brunswick, Georgia. The local ambulance service drove her to Jacksonville to have her stitches taken out and brought her home for $1,400. She could have gone to the hospital in Brunswick for $12, not $100. She's livid at the waste of money, of her children's money and her grandchildren's money, because the government bureaucracy is so inefficient and so incompetent that, in fact, it is gradually going to bankrupt the Medicare system. And we need to say to AARP and others, we want to work with you because we can't afford to have Medicare go broke. There's a second group, the baby boomers. When the baby boomers start to retire, the only way they can draw Social Security is if the Social Security Trust Fund can cash in its U.S. Treasury notes. You can't do that if we are running a giant deficit, because the private market won't be able to replace the money. So all that money that's supposed to be sitting there is sitting there. It's in U.S. Treasury notes. The only way you can start paying it out in Social Security checks is to be able to go to the private market and replace the current Treasury notes with privately placed notes. If you don't balance the budget soon, when the baby boomers start to retire in 2008, the only practical solution will be hyperinflation. Simply wipe out the debt by just inflating it. And if you think that's not possible, look at what's happening to the dollar-yen and dollar-mark relationship. Look at the history of Germany. Look at the history of Brazil. Look at the history of Mexico. Tell me why we are somehow invulnerable. If you break the rules long enough, the rules catch up with you, and then they break you. There's a third group. There's a woman here tonight who's going to have a baby in about 2 weeks. And we're hoping that my commenting on this is not going to lead her to have the baby tonight on the way home. But I was chatting with she and her husband a while ago. If you have a child or a grandchild born this year under the current liberal spending plan, that child in their lifetime will have to pay $187,000 in interest on the debt. That's taxes. Let me repeat, $187,000 in interest on the debt. Just to pay, that's just taxes they'll pay for our debt, not to pay it off, just to pay the interest. That averages about $3,500 a year that they'll pay for every year of their working life. That's before they pay for Social Security and Medicare, before they pay for national defense, before they pay for highways, before they pay for education, before they pay for health care, before they buy a house or buy shoes or go out to lunch. Now that's unconscionable, and it's not going to happen, because there's no society on the planet that can convince its children and grandchildren to take up that kind of burden. So what we're going to do when we go back, and we're going to need your help, is we're prepared to tell the truth to the American people. We are prepared to reshape and remake the federal government. We're prepared to eliminate 4 or more departments if that's what it takes. We're prepared to set priorities. We're prepared to find better ways of doing things. And I want to show you just one example of why I'm so confident this is doable. The U.S. government is today the largest purchaser of these in the Western world. This is an electron tube. It's technically not a vacuum tube, but everybody assumes it is. It's an argon gas inert tube. This is used by the Federal Aviation Administration. Next time you fly somewhere, this is keeping you safe. We have been trying for at least 7 years to quit buying these because they're a little obsolete, based on technology invented about 1895. This, by contrast, is the little gold thing you can barely see, is a computer chip which is the equivalent of 3 million of these. Now, when you have a government whose procurement policy in defense, in air transportation, in health care is so messed up that they are buying this when they could be buying this, I believe it is possible to balance the federal budget and actually have better services at lower cost with greater convenience. And that's part of what this fight's all about, is keeping us trapped in a world that's dying because we can't figure out with good common sense how to liberate our systems to move into the 21st century. Now, I believe all this is very important, and I think it leads us, frankly, to a fight that will start this summer, where we then begin to replace the current income tax either with a flat tax or by eliminating the income tax totally and moving to a sales tax of some kind. But this does go back to some Goldwater and Reagan speeches over the years about taxes, which I won't go into at great length, but I remember what they charged people at the top rate in World War II and how that affected the president, because he actually saw actors who'd only make 1 film a year because the rest of the time they were working 93% of the time for the federal government. The fact is, the IRS is what everything else you say about liberalism. It's too big, it's too intrusive, it's too arrogant. And the Internal Revenue Service now is driving people nuts. They have a brand new program where they're now going to randomly have a negative lottery. If you get picked, they come and audit you, even if they have no evidence you've done anything wrong. We have a little thing we're inventing starting in May called Corrections Day, and it'll be once a week, and we'll correct the federal law for those things that are so dumb you can't really explain them. This will, I think I can give you assurance that we'll be sending the elimination of that lottery program to the Senate sometime in May. But I want everybody to understand, this is the same fight. You're going to find the same people lined up in favor of looking at a flat tax or the elimination of the income tax, and we can argue over which of those is best, but we all agree it's time to get the IRS out of our private lives. You're going to have the same people lined up in favor of that who are going to be lined up in favor of balancing the budget, creating a better Medicare system with more choices for senior citizens and more free enterprise so they have greater control over their lives, making sure we have a balanced budget for the baby boomers so they can retire someday, and making sure we have a balanced budget so our children and grandchildren aren't crushed by our debt. Now, the same team, which includes all the members of the Arizona delegation here tonight, are all going to be in the same group on both those issues. They're all going to be saying, yes, the time has come to change Washington. And, by the way, the same team is going to be defending the IRS, defending the Washington bureaucracies, defending the red tape version of Medicare, defending the old ways of doing things, and they're all going to be saying, oh no, you can't do any of these things. And this is exactly the same fight that was described in Conscience of a Conservative. It's exactly the same fight that was described in A Time for Choosing. Nothing has changed. There's the team that believes in the American people, the team that believes you start with your family and your neighborhood and your work ethic and you create a better future, and there's a team that believes that the American people are unreliable, untrustworthy, and if you don't take the money out of their wallet and hire a good bureaucrat, they won't know what to do. Now, those two teams are the same. The only difference is that we are temporarily a lot stronger than we have been for at least 70 years. And part of the reason I came out here tonight was to remind all of us who are younger how much we stand on the shoulders of these giants. And then to pledge to both Senator Goldwater and to Mrs. Reagan and the President that we are going to go back to Washington imbued with the same courage and the same spirit, and that we are going to have the same kind of commitment to telling the truth and drawing a line in the sand, standing up for the America we believe in, and giving our children and our grandchildren a chance to have the kind of burst of freedom that Senator Goldwater and President Reagan gave us. And that, to me, is the real meaning of tonight. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Speaker Gingrich. Michael Block, the Institute's president, will moderate the question and answer session with Speaker Gingrich. He has a stack of cards with your questions, and I'll turn the mic over to Michael.
Thank you, John. I'm sorry that we can't ask all of these questions, but we'll make a start. I just couldn't resist the question from table 22, which asks, Mr. Speaker, what is your mother's opinion of Nancy Reagan?
My mother thinks that Nancy Reagan is a wonderful person. My mother, I think, at one time probably had a crush on actor Reagan. I think by the time he became president, she had a more mature and politically sophisticated version. At least that's what she told me. But she loves getting to watch Nancy Reagan on television, and she loves very much her taste and her sense of commitment to making sure that President Reagan is all right. And frankly, my mother's heart goes out to Mrs. Reagan, and I hope all of you join me in saying to Nancy that our hearts are with you.
Our second question, how will you be able to balance the budget by 2002, given the Republican Party's ties to senior citizens on Medicare, farmers, and the government dole, including the veterans programs?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that we have ties to I hope we have ties to every American, and that means we can have a mature, honest conversation with every American. I've said flatly, I believe that Social Security is off the table because I think it's impossible to deal with it. And frankly, I would say to any of my friends who want us to try to do something in the next 2 years in Social Security, if you look at the degree to which liberals were not candid about the school lunch program, you can't imagine the level of demagoguery you'd run into. So I think if we say to people, look, this program is currently self-funded. Its problem is that it has U.S. Treasury notes, and we need to make the U.S. Treasury stable. Now, for those of you who are conservatives, let me just suggest to you, that means over the next 7 years, we have an area of $8.8 trillion. That's $8.8 billion in non-Social Security spending to look at. Now, this is enough to keep us busy. And so my challenge, I think, for the Republicans in the House and Senate is, let's totally remake the federal government at every other level. And I would say to you, that means with Bob Stump's leadership on veterans, we go to all the veterans organizations and say, because they all love the country too, what's the best way to have veterans health care at the lowest cost with the greatest access? And let's not be afraid of talking with veterans organizations. It means we go to the senior citizens and say, if, for example, we told every senior citizen, if you save your government money because you're being overbilled or fraudulently billed or wastefully billed, and we let you keep 10% of the money you saved, do you think you could help us lower the cost of Medicare? And if you adopt the position in Arizona, there's one county that has 67% of the folks who are in managed care who seem to like it, are voluntarily in it. In Oregon, they actually pay $70 extra to join. And in other parts of the country, it doesn't even exist yet. So there are lots of ways to offer, I think, 5 or 6 or 7 improvements in Medicare. That means my mother-in-law, who will be 80 this year, my mother and father, who are entering their 70s, you have to treat them like American citizens. You have to say to them, let's tell the truth. I mean, these are not stupid people. These are people who lived through the Depression, lived through the Second World War, defeated the Soviet Empire, held together the World Alliance for 50 years, and you can tell them the truth. The truth is the trustees' report says it's going to go broke, and the liberal politicians don't even want to deal with it until it goes broke. Now let's talk together as citizens. You say to the farming community, including agribusiness in Arizona and agribusiness in Georgia, let's talk as citizens. What kind of program can we afford? How do we organize it? How do we maximize our role in the world market? And I believe most people are prepared to be adults. I don't think you have to run and hide and put your head under a pillow and say, oh, please don't talk about this. And then I think you're going to find a shocking number of Americans who say, as long as everybody's part of it, do what it takes, but don't tell me I've got to steal from my children and grandchildren, and don't tell me I've got to rip off my country, because I'd like to have something better than the Washington interest groups are giving me. And if we have that kind of courage, I think we'll solve it.
Mr. Speaker, you've commented before about how long it takes to implement the death penalty. What are your views on closing the federal courthouse doors to defendants that have had who have available to them an adequate remedy at the state level?
I'll tell you, I heard this about an hour and a half ago, and the truth is I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert in that area. I am very willing to look at it and see if it's doable. I think, again, if you have a state which has an honest judiciary and a state which has which treats the defendant in every way so it's fair, you probably want to make that possible. I think, on the other hand, you would never want to put an innocent American in a situation where, for any reason, under any excuse, they could be railroaded and have no redress. And we have seen times in American history where there were some states that had a system that was so segregated or that was so biased that, frankly, you could not have tolerated in good conscience as an American what might have happened and what did happen, frankly, for a fairly long period. So I'd want to look at it. I certainly think it's worth raising the issue, but I'm not a legal expert, and it's not one I can jump in on this evening.
On the question of regulation, what is the prospects for revisiting the Clean Air Act this year?
Well, it's not Social Security. I mean, I don't know how to say this strongly enough. And I talked to a lot of corporate executives about how do you remake the federal government? How do you change the culture? We have a standing instruction, as I think any of the members of the House will tell you. We did a 130-page briefing, which ran an hour and 20 minutes. And 195 of the 230 House members, including every committee chairman and every member of the leadership, every committee staff director, and every senior leadership staff person, went through that briefing in the 10 days at the very end of the contract period. That briefing says, as part of it, one page says, here are the 8 questions you will ask of every federal program in every subcommittee by July of this year, and if it doesn't pass these 8 questions, we're killing it. Now, I think that also applies not just to money programs, but let's go back through and review the laws. I mean, if we're doing something that is diabolically dumb, my favorite example I'll just give you is not clean air, it's in the Water Act. Mayor Golding of San Diego came to see me. Mayor Golding is being asked by the Environmental Protection Agency, they're trying to order her to it, but they've lost a district court case, to build a secondary waste treatment plant for San Diego, which is perfectly appropriate if you are Cleveland on Lake Erie. San Diego has been attempting to communicate now for about 8 years with EPA that San Diego is not on Lake Erie, that San Diego is on the Pacific Ocean, which is a somewhat larger, deeper body of water than Lake Erie. And in fact, the Scripps Oceanographic Institute testified that the enhanced primary treatment facility in San Diego is fine. It's 350 feet below sea level. It's on the outer continental shelf of the largest body of water in the world. Now, this is not a small issue. The cost of secondary treatment in San Diego is $10 billion. That's $10 billion not to be spent for police, not to be spent for education, not to be had in lower taxes, not to be used for anything except building what will make an EPA bureaucrat in Washington happy. And that's where we invented Corrections Day. Now, my attitude is we're extending to every governor, every county commissioner, every mayor, every corporation, every trade association. You find us the dumbest things in the current law, we'll repeal them on Corrections Day. And we'll, 1 day a week, Barbara Vukanovich, just north of you in Nevada, is in charge of this, and 1 day a week we're going to bring in bills and send them to the Senate where if something truly makes no sense, let's quit doing it. I know it sounds radical, but just let's quit doing it. Maybe one more.
Our last question. Many of us are concerned that our 2 political parties are becoming too polarized. Would you comment on
that? Sure. I think it is absolutely inevitable in a period of dramatic change that you go through a polarization. Because we are saying, look, the direction of America's future is replace the welfare state with an opportunity society, reassert American civilization, which includes things like the work ethic, locking up violent criminals, balancing the federal budget, putting power back home. We're arguing for you having the money in your family budget. They want the money in the federal budget. These are not negotiable things. These are 2 dramatically different visions. Now, our vision, as I said earlier, started, I think, with Bill Buckley's founding of National Review and Barry Goldwater's publication of Conscience of a Conservative. It grew to maturity with Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan crisscrossing this country for almost 20 years. And in that process, we came to a point where we now know we want to go in this direction. Our good friends who are they're good Americans. They're liberals. This is a legitimate, honorable disagreement among citizens. They want to go over here. They're not negotiable. You can't have both. And so we're going to go through a brief period of decision. I think the 96 election and the 98 election will be decisive. The American people will either choose personal responsibility, require the work ethic, require schools that actually educate, get violent people off the street, get power out of Washington back home, reassert the importance of the family. I mean, we're either going to go that way, or the American people will say, I don't mind what I see in the evening news, don't do anything too serious. Those are the choices. And during that brief interim, the 2 parties are just going to go like this. That's what they did in the 1930s. It's what they did in 1896. It's what they did in 1856. It's what they did in 1828. There is a virtue to being a history teacher. Now all of you have to go back home and pull up those dates and figure out what I'm talking about. All I'm suggesting to you, and the reason I came here tonight is in a spirit, I guess, of President Reagan when he used to say, you ain't seen nothing yet. All I'm suggesting to you is you go back to those lonely days in the early 50s when Barry Goldwater was by himself. Then you come up through the great period of the Reagan presidency when we began to truly change the entire planet. Now you look at 30 Republican governors, control of the Senate, control of the House, a dynamic movement that I think really has a chance to take off. And I think there's every reason to believe you ain't seen nothing yet, and I'm proud to be here with 2 of the people who are part of the reason we can say that with great confidence in the future. Thank you very, very much.
Well, what an evening this has been. It has sparkled with celebrated guests. It has given Arizona the opportunity to thank Ronald Reagan for everything he has done for our nation. Having Mrs. Reagan here to accept this award has indeed been special for us. And Speaker Gingrich is living proof that President Reagan's efforts have set us on the right path, and we are truly fortunate to have Newt carrying the torch for America. Thank you. When you introduce your special guests, it seems like you always have to forget somebody. And I do want to recognize, before the evening is over, our former governor and his wife, Jack Williams and Vera. I don't know where they're sitting, but thank you. In closing, I want to recognize some important people on our staff. Please join me in thanking our executive director, Jeff Flake, for making this evening such a success. Jeff, will you and your wife, Cheryl, please stand? And special thanks to Mary Gifford. She made it all come together. And thank you to Carrie Larson, Greg Picow, and John Kakritz, also from the Institute's office. They have all worked long and hard. Will everyone please remain seated following the benediction to allow time for Mrs. Reagan and the Goldwaters to exit the ballroom. Thank you. Now Reverend Nelson will return to the podium to close our program with the benediction.
Let us pray. O God, the twilight has given way tonight, a reminder that much of the world is embraced by darkness. Remind us that the morning will come and that we are to be bearers of light. So dismiss us with your blessing and embrace us with your presence, both now and forever. Amen.
Well, this officially ends our annual award dinner. Again, thank you for coming. Have a safe journey home, and we'll see you next year. Good night.